Just a few words from the Mosaic Rooms here in London. We are a project of the A.M. Katan Foundation with a gallery and bookshop for contemporary art and culture, and are co-hosting this event with a new center. And I think it's amazing the kind of synergies that have been produced by the speakers and the participants in the first session. Yeah, so the event is in alignment with our program and our exhibitions, where we aim to initiate dialogue and debate about social, political, and cultural issues in the Arab world and beyond. I will keep the introduction a bit briefer than before, since some participants are rejoining, and to leave more time. So I'm very pleased to introduce Heba and Anthony. We're currently hosting Heba's solo exhibition, her first UK exhibition, monograph exhibition, When I See the Future, I Close My Eyes, which is curated by Anthony Downey. And the public program is developed by them, and they will tell you more about it. So Heba Amin is a multimedia artist from Egypt. She works with political themes and archival history, using mediums including film, photography, lecture performance, and installation. She also teaches at Bard College Berlin, is a doctorate fellow in art history at Freie Universität, and a current Field of Vision fellow in New York. She's a co-founder of the Black Athena Collective, curator of visual art for the Misner Journal, and co-curator for the biennial residency program Default with Random Association. Anthony Downey is professor for visual culture in the Middle East and North Africa at Birmingham City University. He is currently a co-investigator on AHRC and GCRF funded research projects that focus on cultural practices, education, and digital methodologies in Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. He sits on the editorial boards of Third Text and Digital War, respectively, and is a series editor for research practice, Sternberg Press. And we just also published, they also just published the book, The Generous Stork, about Heba's project, which is available now, if you're interested. And yes, saying this, I hand over and thank everyone who is making this event so brilliant. And I'm looking forward to the outcomes and continuation of it.
Sigmund, thank you. Mohammed, thank you for the earlier session. That was fantastic. It'll be really interesting to see what comes out of this. But for those of you who are just joining us, very briefly, just point out that when Heba and I were putting together the show, three key areas came to the fore, and that was around drone technologies, surveillance systems, and digital authoritarianism. And it became immediately apparent that all of these works exist within and indeed are motivated by digital technologies. So when we came to think about an expanded online program, it largely became a question of what forms of critical knowledge about the digital could be produced through digital means. And of course, the online program we were hoping would answer to some of those issues. Speaking to the earlier session with the contributions by Martina, Brunella, and Valentin, I mean, what came out there for me personally was a number of distinct areas of inquiry. And again, it returned me to one of the questions Heba and I was asking, we're asking, how does practice think through and critically engage with digital systems of knowledge rather than just exist within them? So this element, I think, is one of the key concerns within the show, and I was really pleased to see how it was unfurling throughout the context of our earlier session. I was particularly interested, Mohammed, to see how the question of the harvesting of knowledge, the extent to which it has increasingly become a way to predictively anticipate, if not define, our innermost desires and fears. And this harvesting of data, or the life patterns produced by behavioral surplus, this would seem to give rise to a specter of technological determinism. And I'm really pleased to see that we didn't go down that route earlier, that we veered away from this technological deterministic argument, which returned me, at least, to the question of what the speculative logic of critical practice does, how it can rethink the issues of knowledge transfer and knowledge dissemination. It was interesting as well to see the extent to which contingency came into the discussion. I kept thinking of Mallarmé and his quote, "A throw of the dice will never abolish chance, which seems to a certain extent to be quite pessimistic, because we could ask the question, what if a throw of the dice does abolish chance, even for a moment? Which brought me to think about quantum computing, the whole sort of issue around quantum computing. I mean, a momentary hiatus within the logic of quantum computing and deep neural network learning systems basically destroys the system or brings the system down, or you have to reboot the system. And I kept thinking about potentially what this particular session has been doing. To a certain extent, it has been about introducing a degree of contingency, introducing chance, but also creating a hiatus, a space within which to engage with precisely these discursive levels of debate. So I'm going to leave it at that and pass over to Heba, because obviously we have a second session now and the debate could go in a very different direction. But it'd be very interesting to see at the end of this, Mohammed, what comes back. Will we end up with a recursive echo chamber? I don't think so. Will it expand what we understand to be critical discourse in relation to thinking through the digital? And again, I look forward to seeing what the end result of this will be, or at least the momentary result of this will be. So I will pass over to Heba. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. And thank you, especially Brunella and Valentin, for that last session. I'm just going to be very brief and want to thank Mohammad for co-hosting this with us again. And I'd like to do a proper introduction this time. Mohammad is an independent Berlin-based artist and curator, and he's also the organizer with the New Center. And I'd also like to thank Martina Cavalot, who is also, her involvement is crucial to organizing all of this, and our upcoming speakers, Reza, Negarestani, and Patricia Reed. I really look forward to what you bring to the table. So the floor is yours.
Just before Reza and Patricia start, I wanted to basically, like, for those of you who follow me on Facebook, right? I've been doing this thing. It started with chance in 2013, where I began using Siri to basically dictate my messages to friends. I was just tired of typing, right? And I was saying something about Iranian politics, and then it really, like, the chance brought a complete new meaning into it. And I was just like, oh my God, this is really interesting, right? And then I made my first post. Ever since then, it's one of the things I do. Like, I use Siri a lot to dictate what I'm saying in text messages, or like WhatsApp, or even like Facebook statuses. But like 3 times a month, it's really insightful and amazing the way Siri misreads you, but also gives you something totally intelligent beyond what you understand, right? So I thought, like, so far what we've done with the text, in a moments of brilliance that came out of the experiment, which was you inputting those words into the chat box next, and then Castro putting them into Valentin's system, and then the system generating the paragraph. The moments of intelligence and clarity were kind of like those Siri moments. And what we did was, we basically the 5 different versions that the system gave us, me and Martina, we briefly copy edited them, very brief. We only had like 10 minutes to do it, right? And just put periods and capitalization and maybe a couple of commas and maybe a verb or a noun or a the or a or something. And what you see up there, you can like read it as a form of distraction from Reza and Patricia. So this is what we have on the sidebar, which is these 5 different iterations of something. And it's not all the words. So also we asked you to try the system in that 1 hour. I don't know if any of you were able to produce anything that is good. If you did, please share it with us, because we can add those to these paragraphs, right? And then see where we can go. But I just wanted to like tell you this, and then basically pass the mic on to Patricia to begin. And then we can go back to any of this a little bit later after Patricia and Reza. Basically, the format so far has been Patricia will speak, and then Reza speak, and then maybe they can engage each other a little bit with questions of clarity about what they talked about. And then I will ask some questions, Martina will ask some questions, and then people will ask some questions. Meanwhile, the production can go on the sidebar text at the same time. Okay, Patricia, please, without introduction. Should I introduce you? I have bios too.
No.
I think we can just let you, right?
It's fine. I can just introduce myself as the perpetual tennis loser when I engage with Heba on the courts. But thanks for having us tonight. And I'm really curious to see what everyone, like how this whole pedagogical experiment is going to work. And since we're here to think through kind of the limits of computational technologies, as well as pedagogies that are amenable for a planetary condition, and how they relate to possible political action, there's basically a few loosely sort of interconnected points I'd like to bring up that are hopefully useful for the discussion. And on a personal note, but also relevant to the topic, is one of the more sort of general but long-lasting critiques, I would believe it was Reza, that had brought up to me at some point regarding the Xenofeminist Manifesto, which I was a part of writing several years ago. And that was to point out a significant blind spot with the question of, where is the pedagogical program in this? So this question has kind of stuck with me ever since, but kind of informally, especially, now since I've become more involved in teaching over the last few years. So I'm currently trying to tackle it more directly under the provisional proposition of a pedagogy of hurricanes, which is very loose at the moment, but I thought I'll throw it out in the spirit of generosity. And I'll outline it a little bit later on. And there was also a notion introduced in the essay by Robert Brandon that Reza had submitted for reading. And this was the idea of an unresolved pedagogical program. So while Brandon discusses the differences between so-called solved pedagogical method for teaching addition and multiplication, and the unresolved status of teaching division and subtraction, I'm really curious how we could maybe apply such a notion towards more, say, consequential problem spaces, by way of which I mean, what are the pedagogies demanded of us for worlds to come, for worlds that we do not yet concretely exist, and therefore cannot know or teach as an actualized configuration of coexistence. So I want to kind of think about that without succumbing to the sort of pitfalls of mystifying the unknown. So that pedagogical problem is present, at least in the background of my thought, and one that could perhaps discuss in the context of world building. And I also think it's here in the spirit of Rancière's ignorant schoolmaster figure, kind of comes to mind, where it's more about constructing conditions of pedagogical enablement rather than the transmission of knowledge from, a master to a student. So again, my short intro is more about raising points or topics, questions, rather than coming to you with some like fully fledged propositions. So the first point I just want to suggest, and it sounds like you've already been getting at that in the first session, is that I think we need a wider picture of what computational technologies are, since in our everyday usage, computation seems to be kind of synonymous with digitality, or even conflated with just the internet, which is also into itself a huge limitation. And quite honestly, I'm really not sure what is meant by the rather vague techno-historical index of post-digitality, but perhaps it's more useful to see it as creating post-digital conceptions of computation, which also help to kind of situate the discovery and not invention of computation, as Ben Bratton has said, within a longer historical framework, such that even language itself, as in his critique, but as Giuseppe Longo had seen as a kind of pre-digital form of computation. And the second point on the question of AI specifically, and a kind of full disclosure, this is not my primary area of research, so I'm a bit of an outsider here. But I think even from this vantage point, I can detect two, I think, equally necessary approaches at play today, but ones that I think on the surface seem to be a little bit butting heads together. And perhaps it's in a gesture of hopefully generative diplomacy and not just mere consensus building, that I think we may be able to bridge some of these surface tensions. So on the one hand, we have the critical discourses around AI, ones that also appear outside of academic discourses and popular media, which are broadly criticisms of machine learning applications, including the inductive statistical operations of data sets that drive them, not to mention the black boxing of such procedures. Now, since data sets are archives of dominant, widely recorded human histories, there's basically an entrenchment, or at least a great risk of entrenchment, of existing geographic dominances, racial, gendered, sexual, linguistic biases that are constitutive structural conditions of our societies and not mere accidental oversights. So these are essential criticisms since they highlight the abuses of machine learning as they increasingly permeate decision-making processes like in the criminal justice system, or who gets credit, who gets loans. And other thinkers may emphasize in the affirmative other uses of machine learning, such as in climate modeling, notably in the vaccine development for COVID-19, and in physics. So, but I think in either of these analyses, whether critical or affirmative, AI is primarily treated either as a tool, examined for its uses and abuses, and is primarily located within the ambit of existing or given humanist configurations of techno-social reality. So I think the artificial in this scenario is presumed to be a type of intelligence that is distinct from whatever we would mean by any sort of natural intelligence of the human. So on the other hand, there are thinkers who proceed from the basis that intelligence itself, that may or may not belong to a human, is already bound to processes of artificialization. So this is, of course, this is part of Reza's work. So to quote him here, mind has never had and never will have a given nature. It becomes mind by positing itself as an artifact of its own concept. By realizing itself as an artifact of its own concept, it becomes able to transform itself according to its own necessary concept by first identifying and then replacing or modifying its conditions of realization, disabling and enabling constraints, end quote. And those who may be familiar with the work of Sylvia Wynter and her genres of being human may recognize some resemblances here, insofar as her critique of existing Euro-liberal monohumanism is bound to an instrumentalized bio-overdetermination of the human in order to justify practices of domination. Of course, not just economically, but epistemically and racially as well. So I think her work is particularly relevant since it fundamentally grapples with the Janus-faced historical reality of the Enlightenment in practice, at once a liberation of generic human intelligence, but also one that became the selectively embodied metric through which to justify enslavement, despite the latter being at logical odds with the principles of its emancipatory claims. So while she does not use the term artificial, her insistence on the human as part bios, part logos, and mythoi is what forges a picture of the human as homo narrans, right? That's as a narrative creature. So as historical and biological entities. So in very different ways and different language, but distinct from the other analysis we mentioned before, I think both Reza and Sylvia Wynter take on more cosmological dimensions of the question of artificiality as it relates to humanists by recognizing and activating this dimension of being human as it is manifest in manners of doing, right? So where I think these two positions may meet, at first they seem at odds with one another. But where they may meet is potentially in the context of world building. Because if we recall that for Nelson Goodman, all procedures of world making, they start from worlds already at hand. So all making is a remaking. So what that means in practice is that we start from given conditions. In this case, the uses and abuses of AI or machine learning in a socio-technical context. So of course, a critical scrutiny of the given is absolutely necessary. The question, however, and this maybe points to the speculative mention that was mentioned in the intro. So the question, however, is how to construct new worlds from materials at hand, where merely pointing to the given or diagnosing the given falls short. And in a way, I think how critique in a way sort of operates in a mode of preserving the given as a negative object, right? It always needs the given to point to. So there needs to be this kind of additional step of making that given redundant, right? Not just pointing to it, but making it redundant or irrelevant. And so just the very short last point that I'll raise before Reza takes over concerns the question of pedagogy specifically, and what I've been toying with as a description for a provisional model of what I'm thinking of right now. It may be idiotic, but whatever, you have to start somewhere, is a pedagogy of hurricanes. And I kind of wanted to introduce this as a speculative response to the convergence of, what we see as the convergence of anthropogenic, biological, technical, chemical, and geological histories indexed by the Anthropocene. So basically to try to find modes of pedagogy that can, that are amenable to that convergence or that layering of various histories. Excuse me. So one of the central unsolved pedagogical problems of our condition concerns the invention of ways to make the complex planetary systems within which we live intelligible and subsequently more navigable, including, I think, the modes of causation that are not locally containable. So we can already see, I think, in our particular moment, a lot of struggle around understanding more, let's say, profound modes of causation, right? We seem to even have trouble understanding that or behaving in ways where we acknowledge that our, that public health is conditional upon, mutual interactions. The fact that, how would we even start to enter into some more, let's say, widespread discourse about the longer term causes of this kind of pandemic. Like, for example, that one would have to radically re-engineer food production, for instance, in order to mitigate such pandemics in the future, right? Those sort of causal chains are really seem to be deeply absent from, mainstream political discourse. So I'm kind of really concerned about this idea of understanding causation a little bit better. So this idea of this kind of pedagogical method folds into the definition of productive navigation raised by Guarino Mazzola, where navigation is not just steering about existing bodies of knowledge, which is, I think, often, that's often the sort of misconception of what navigation is. It's just like steering the ship amongst the given. But he says rather, productive navigation concerns the transformation of search spaces themselves, meaning that bodies of knowledge are themselves reconfigured and cannot be cannot be inventoried as an encyclopedia into, static alphabetizable form. So it's not only asking questions of how to search, it's about creating different search spaces, which means creating different perspectives and points of entry. So the idea with the object of the hurricane or typhoon is that it's both local and planetary entity. It's both territorially specific and oceanically expansive, right? It can't be bound. You can't have like American studies of hurricanes, for instance. It wouldn't be possible. It wouldn't make sense. To properly examine a hurricane, its causes, risks, and asymmetric regionally bound effects requires the coordination of ways of knowing that emphasize the relations between and across climactic, geological, technical, social, and biospheric domains, more so than emphasizing their disciplinarily fragmented perspectives and analysis, no matter how invaluable they are. So it's more about shifting the terrain of pedagogy to understanding the space of relationships more than these kind of isolated things. And I think this, kind of draws some degree of inspiration from this, from the more geopolitically oriented ideas of debordering that Achille Mbembe has introduced when he addresses the planetary. But I think this also extends to bodies of knowledge as well. Like, what would that mean to apply that sort of concept of debordering to knowledge practices? And so I think with that, I'll just leave those, ideas out on the table and hand it over to Reza for, if that's okay.
I just wanted to say that just for people to be introduced to Nelson Goodman and his concepts of world making, I basically summarized the book this summer for an exhibition in Moscow. And I will share that text on the sidebar because it's very systematic, his idea of world making, and it goes through 5 different stages. And I think it's very productive to compare his 5 stages actually with these types of algorithms that are trying to produce human intelligence, right? And see how comparable they are. Even if we don't do it in this session, I think it's useful to have my summary. I'm not producing much there. It's just summary of the book for the exhibition. I just posted on a sidebar just because you mentioned Nelson Goodman, and I think it's important. A lot of people are coming to it, as usual, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, Reza.
Great.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mo. Thank you, everyone, for hosting us. And thank you, Patricia, for the great talk. As always, I'm kind of disorganized. I have a few remarks on various aspects of education in terms of what actually education should be thought of coherently, in terms of issues around autodidacticism, which I think is the core of the philosophy of education rather than academia, and certain other kinds of remarks about the idea of basically doing education within digital media, within particularly during this time, and of course, the kind of criticisms that this kinds of online education usually garners, from some misguided philosophers. So, more importantly, first, I actually agree with Hegel. What is education? Hegel calls education the quakening of the singularity of the will. What does that mean? It sounds very, posh. Quakening of the singularity of the will. So quakening of the singularity of the will, in Hegelian sense, he has this idea that basically there is already a germ of autonomy or self-determination within every child. So even if they don't speak language, right? There is a germ of self-determination or autonomy for every child. And this is what he calls what is basically what later become, if it is cultivated collectively, becomes first concrete autonomy as an adult, from this kind of abstract autonomy into a concrete autonomy, and from there, if collectively cultivated by way of education, it becomes an organon of concrete self-consciousness. Critical self-consciousness. So so the thing is that, and this is not just Hegel, Sebastian Rohl, German philosopher, has already been talking about the same thing with regard to Kant, that in contrast to many 20th century philosophers like McDowell, Wittgenstein, so on and so forth, the end game of education is not the attainment of autonomy. In fact, education begins with autonomy at its scaffolding. And that's the autonomy, the proto-autonomy of the child. The child has an autonomy. It's just that it is not cultivated yet. It is not autonomy in a concrete sense. So the idea of education is simply, and if we think about education from this transformation of abstract autonomy to concrete autonomy of the adult, and from the concrete autonomy of single or individual adult to a historical critical self-consciousness in a collective sense, then when we are talking about when we are talking about education, it would be extremely parochial to think about education in terms of academia or how we are supposed to teach here or there. No, we are talking about a range of activities that include child nurturing to what you might call to be higher and ongoing education, right? In a broadest possible sense. So in that sense, we can also think about education. So if education in this sense is kind of a stepwise and sustained cultivation of certain kinds of faculties, cognitive faculties, which allow us to form objective thinking about our place in the world, then if that is the case, education can also be formulated in a different way. Completely similar to the first, but a different kind of iteration of it. And that is usually what you might call to be the Vygotsky, Tolstoy, the educationists of the 20th century have been talking about. What is that? So if every cognition is a fruit of a recognition, right? You know, Hegel 101, Kant 101, if every cognition is a fruit of recognition, and we have different kinds of, or levels or modes of recognition, political, cultural, between mother and child, between parents and the child, between the teacher, the trainer and the trainee, and they're all having their own different contexts, so on and so forth. Then in order for us to enable, enhance, and further diversify theoretical and practical cognitive faculties required for better objective thinking in the world within a child, and we are all children, you know, from this educational perspective, then it means that the ultimate end game of education is the concretization and diversification of modes of recognition. Modes of recognition, right? So that's number one. And pedagogy in this sense, whether it is about human or AGI, which I don't really make any difference between these two really as a matter of theoretical undergirding. If there is a true AGI, it is human, it's sapiens. Because human is not a species. It is essentially sapiens. It is essentially encapsulation of reasons, theoretical and practical, namely abilities to structure the world. That which can structure the world, structure its place in the world and make values about such a structuration is a human. It does not matter whether it is made of flesh and blood, organic materials, or it's just some sort of silicon-based thing, AGI, right? It doesn't matter, really, it doesn't matter. So in that case, we can say that this also means something actually quite interesting, that if we have already basically dissolved some of the pernicious some of the pernicious and contingent distinctions between AGI and the human by way of the idea of education, by decanting or distilling the idea of education, means that any sort of pedagogy that we are going to think about is going to be a pedagogy of human AGI. And what is AGI if not the outside view of our own selves as incomplete historically, just like AGI? What AGI is just simply this, is an outside view of ourselves as historically incomplete. Right? Who are we? And the whole task of pedagogy is to not to answer this, but to enable us, give us tools, our momentarium of new faculties, or what I would say that like Leibniz or the early, romantic philosophers, a certain kind of mathesis universalis of objective thinking in the world, such that we not only understand who we are and what we are in the world, but also by virtue of such understanding, we can create a project of attributing values of our navigation in this open landscape, which is the world, right? World in the Nelson Goodmanian sense, not as a fixed world, but a world that precisely a world is nothing but a fruit of cognitions. And to understand a world concretely, we need to make new worlds, which he calls world versions. And what are these world versions? Which is a task of education. A child that doesn't have world versions essentially has a very parochial or narrow understanding of what the world is, because these world versions are just like these satellites through which we form new perspectives unto which we already thought is fixed, has a very foundational status. So these world versions are basically allowing us to recognize the world in which we already inhabit, right? So education is also this, and that's the whole point of pedagogy thing. First diversifying and enhancing cognitive faculties or abilities, theoretical and practical. From there, in order to do that, we are going to basically enhance the recognitive capabilities at multiple levels, social, cultural, so on and so forth. Then from there, understanding that the result of all these is creating a scenario or creating a horizon, so to speak, in which a child can cognize a world that has been given to him or her or it anew. That every cognition is a recognition. So this is like the end game of education, that to cognize a world, we have to cognize it anew, to recognize it. So that's education 101. Now, how much time do I have?
You can go on. I will like let you know if you are going.
Yes, please.
Because you still need to address the AI and AGI aspect of pedagogy, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the idea is that I think that when it comes to the idea of AI, so when we are talking about AI, what do you actually mean? I mean, are we talking about a simple training routes, or training basically algorithm in the sense of certain kind of procedures, right? Certain kind of procedures that can be replicated across the board, right? So that's what we might call to be training. We call it training or formal learning, you know. But with regard to it, so that's something that we can talk about with regard to AI. With regard to AGI, artificial general intelligence, if we are going to talk about it coherently, it should be at the very least at the level of what we call the human, right? So if basically the minimum minimum designation for AGI is the human, we cannot talk about the idea of training anymore. So training needs to be supplemented with something else. Look, I mean, Tolstoy had this very great idea that, you know, that he created one of the first open schools in Russia after he basically abandoned his heritage, you know, his feudal inheritance and stuff. That you know, and this is something that education is throughout the 20th century and beyond understood. That when you are trying to teach, you cannot repeat the same program for different kinds of children, right? It is not simply a formal training like AI. Why? Precisely because AGI is really education in the Hegelian sense. It is the quakening of the singularity of the will, that each person, if we count AGI as a person, and if the possibility of it arises, it will be a person, because that is the definition of person, capable of basically putting forward a series of theoretical and practical cognitions leading to certain kinds of value mongering, attribution of values, certain kinds of actions autonomously. So if that is the case, then that is the definition of person. And hence, AGI would be exactly how we define education for human should be attributed to AGI, as opposed to AI, as a kind of, route basically learning, or this kinds of formal inductive learning, which is basically, it is a fundamental form of learning, but it is not the totality of the story. With regard to, essentially, with regard to idea of education, of an agent, and here we are basically treating a possible future AGI as an agent. With regard to educating an agent, education can only be in response to the concrete experiences of that agent. Like, this doesn't mean that everyone should get a private teacher to feed his or her experiences, but that simply to address the context of my experience. Like you for example, think about that you are going to bring I don't know, a French teacher to, I don't know, to a Yemenis child, right? It just doesn't work. It just produces French children, It is not really, so, but that doesn't mean, however, this doesn't mean that we have to think that education is not a universalist enterprise. Education is a universalist enterprise, but not universalism by way of fusing, namely, basically forcing the boundaries between concrete experiences, historical, social, economic, so on and so forth, to dissolve, right? That wouldn't be a real education. Education should preserve such distinctions, but also understand that there are certain kinds of procedures within the educational infrastructure that run across the globe. You know, for example, think about this, that everyone, we can teach every child how to use programming languages, right? Regardless of their cultures. So what does that mean? It means that education literally is exactly what self-consciousness means. So self-consciousness, as Hegel would understand, runs in two different directions. One toward, you know, enhancements and diversification of modes of rationality, logic and stuff, you know, things are historically concrete and need to be understood in terms of their specificity, so on and so forth. And the other one toward a certain kind of naturalization. You know, obviously, when we are talking about how I see the world, some of the ways that I see the world are because of my naturalized upbringing. I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, right? I see this sort of color precisely because my brain works like that. But there's also certain kinds of way that I see a red rose that evoke certain kinds of imagery, certain kinds of concepts, precisely because of my cultural and historical upbringing. So you see, a good education is the one that, just like a good education of AGI or human being, that covers both dimensions, naturalization dimension, naturalized dimension, and what you might call to be the historical, cultural dimension, so on and so forth. So that's number two. Number three, I don't know how I can begin even with these criticisms about online you know, learning and online education coming from people from, you know, in a tongue-in-cheek manner by people like Zuboff, surveillance capitalism, or in a more, you know, to the face by people like Agamben. I think that I would say simply one thing. People who think that online education is very different from physical education simply have certain kind of nature chauvinism, meaning that they have these kinds of idea of nature or how natural or physical education is as opposed to something else. Like people, so for example, I have actually talked to certain kinds of friends that they say that, well, you know, these online classes on Zoom, and this was before the COVID-19, right? It was far before. Are not natural. Natural in what sense? I mean, is there anything natural about education? In fact, education is the promotion of being unnatural. You know, it emerges and becomes the promotion of being unnatural. Meaning not unnatural, not in a negative sense, but to be able to do something that is not given to you. If education is not this, then what is it? And if this last resort to nature culture in this kinds of being parochialized, particularly in this context of physical space versus this digital space, is promotion of a certain form of intellectual chauvinism for lived experience, then I don't see what it is. I mean, there's lived experience in the most shallow sense, because you see, lived experience is the idea that everyone, as I mentioned, has its own experiences and they should be dealt with concrete. If such problems cannot be dealt with by way of this medium, then definitely they cannot be dealt with in a physical space either. Like what is physical space actually giving you that makes it more conducive to address lived experience? It doesn't, it really doesn't. Second, of course, there is a certain kinds of Western argument from the privilege here too. I mean, Mo knows that many of us who play contributed to the new center as one of these places, as alternative places, bastions. Would love to have basically a chat with our students in a physical space, smoke cigarette with them, so on and so forth. But look, we couldn't get a visa. We weren't allowed to go to these places. So there are all these kind of layers and layers of social assumptions that go into these kinds of arguments, which make them, first of all, fundamentally muddled. So muddled that every sort of criticism that we levy against them or trying to rescue them will be, again, muddling the water even further. Yeah, and that's bad. Last one, this is something that Mo and I have been talking about. I mean, we have different ideas, but I mean, we get along in terms of these things. For me, the idea of education can only arise from autodidacticism. Autodidacticism means the quakening of one's will by one's education, by one's own education, self-education. That the point of education, autodidacticism, doesn't mean simply self-teaching. You know, everyone can self-teach, myself, English. No, it is to be autodidact means that by virtue of educating myself in a certain way, I have a fundamentally a style or form, in a Platonistic sense, a form of life which is of my own and for which I am responsible, whether bad or good. But nevertheless, it is really something very different. And to that extent, I would say, within this autodidactic scenario of education, the only insecurity that one ought to hone out, to sharpen, is intellectual security. Intellectual insecurity. The more you render yourself intellectually insecure, the more you have a chance to re-educate yourself. You see, that's the main point. So for me, autodidacticism is really the core of education, re-education of one's life. You know, because everyone can make education, and education usually can also lead to entrenchment of biases and dogmas. But to re-educate yourself means to shed biases in every occasion. You see, for me, I think that there are para-academia or alternative education should be a bastion of this kind of re-education, rather than re-education in a Maoist sense of re-educate. Like, look, we didn't manage to get to academia. That's why basically we became autodidacts. Now, I don't think that the idea of education should simply be about this idea that those people who were autodidacts should be re-educated, like in Maoist sense, re-education to the countryside and up to the mountains of academia. It shouldn't be like that. I think that we can make a bastion of education outside of academia that first basically give credence and nurture autodidacticism, and only second, re-education for those people who want to go to academia. Thank you.
Thank you, Reza. Patricia, would you like to interact with Reza a little bit, if you have something to interact with? Because I'm sure
if I must.
You don't have to, but like, because
no, I'm joking. I have
Valentin, and I'm sure they would like to say something too.
No, I have loads of questions, and thanks for that, Reza, by the way.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Helpful. I guess one question that I have is on this, or one word that I'm having more and more trouble with is autonomy, and I wonder if you clarify a little bit that, because one way that I've been seeing things, especially when you are doing this comparative of, let's say, this, you know, academia versus autodidactism, is, and both of course have this prefix auto, like self-related or whatever, self-initiated, is the problem of this kind of like re-entrenchment of individual authorship, etc. That's the incentivized mode in academia, right? I think that's partly why in the formal institution or the formal structure in academia, it actually, you could say it disincentivizes re-education, because one has to stake a claim, a knowledge territory.
Yes,
and that's a
absolutely.
competitive territory. One has to be the most recognized, cited, etc. in that territory. And therefore there is, let's say 5 years from now, you realize, oh shit, I have to change position. I have a different thing.
Right.
You're like
you won't get a
disincentivized.
tenure at this point.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. And
Yes.
so there's that side of it, which is, so that's like kind of where I see the autodidact, argument. Absolutely. It has no fidelity to a territory of knowledge. It has fidelity to its own possible fallibility, right?
Yes, definitely so.
But
mitigation of ignorance.
Okay, but then if you can't think for yourself, like in your own words, you don't have your own mind. So then if we don't have our own mind, and that's a productive thing. So that's what I'm kind of really trying to focus more on, that entanglement, and what is education with a robust acknowledgement of a deprivatized mind, of a deprivatized self, etc. Which is about all those codependencies, right?
Yes.
Then how does the auto fit into that? I mean, like, how does that work? Is that like prefix, or that notion?
Auto in the sense of autonomy.
Yeah, is it worth preserving? Is it, or in
Yes.
light of that deprivatized sense?
Right. You see, I think autonomy is simply, this is why I think that if you remember, I said that, a child, so many of these education is like normativist education. Is like, Sellars, McDowell, I don't know, many of these people, Wittgenstein, they think that, the end game of education is autonomy. But no, I think that, which is basically, I think that not only it disregards the idea of what educating a child entails or means, because the child already has autonomy, but also precisely, as you say, putting the end game of education in this idea of autonomy, it makes it, then we're back in the square one, in that kind of still privatized, ahistorical, bloated idea of, the will of the person or the mind of the person, right? No, I think that I think a different thing is, as Hegel would have said, or Kant probably even, autonomy begins as a formal core, as a scaffolding, right? As an abstract scaffolding for recognition of myself within the world, and of course the people around me. And this then can become concrete through the course of education. And so autonomy is necessary, but it's neither the end game of education, nor it's sufficient to the progress of education. It is simply what you might call to be something that ought to be there in a formal sense, in order for self-consciousness to arise. And self-consciousness is not autonomy in any sort of metaphysically bloated way.
Okay, so basically there's no axiological connection to your claim of autonomy. It's really like a formal condition of possibility.
Yeah, it's a formal condition,
Yes.
absolutely. It's a necessary formal condition,
Okay.
yes.
Because that was like another question I had, was this like linkage you were making, because this for me is, I'm like intrigued, but
I just
I'm
want
also
to say, Patricia, thank you for that clarification.
Yeah,
like the question was really good. Thank you so much.
no problem. The next sort of point that I wanted to just ask about, because this is something that I always struggle with in my own work, because I think I'm not a philosopher, so I always try to like take ideas and see how they, how they fit into, like, let's say I'm trying to be address more like politically urgent things and not doing philosophy so much in the background as you. And then one question that I really struggle with that I think is this connection between the recognition and the axiological side that you connect it to, in the sense of like, you know, if I know something, if I come to some self-conscious, you know, new piece of knowing, a minor transformation, then what is that process of translation between knowing something, learning something, and then translating that into that value form, as you said?
Well, of course, this is something that is not straightforward. I mean, any sort of answer that I might give would be watering down of the problem.
Sure.
From one very narrow parochial perspective, myopic perspective, you can think that, so when we are actually making knowledge claims, okay, these knowledge claims, precisely because they have already been made within this intersubjective recognitive realm, they are becoming norms. They have the propensity to become norms, in the sense that Plato understood it as ingredients of physis. Physis is, by physis, people think nature, but when nature, Plato thinks about nature, it doesn't mean nature in a sort of kind of nature the materialists think about. Nature in the sense that there is no nature other than the structure of rationality that is projected upon the stuff given to us, the stuff of the world, right? These are objective norms, and objective norms require certain kind of knowledge, as opposed to social conventions. So norms in that sense, rather than social convention, right? Like, for example, a good example that I always give to my students, for making values about sheltering people, or having a shelter, or have a house, first you need to have norms of house building. To have that, you need to know how to make a house in the first place. Like a carpenter, a carpenter's, mason, so on and so forth, starts to develop knowings, theoretically and practically, of how to make a house. Once you make a house, and this house becomes basically responds to a certain kind of end, and proves itself to be sustainable, you know, in time and in practice, then it becomes a norm of house building. And this norm of house building is something that to which we can project values, right? Because you need to have some sort of stability for something to be receptive to values and disvalues. So this is what we're saying, that, you know, having a house is great, like basically shelters my children, so on and so forth, right? So there is a certain kinds of value ascription here that comes with this long procedure of knowing and cognitions. But then it is very opposed, it's very in contrast, not opposed, in contrast with norms in a different way, normative values in a different way. In terms of codes of laws. Codes of laws also ascribe values. Like, for example, think about this. Think about basically an organization of masons that they have issued a code of law that, as we have seen it, to make a house, you have to basically require to use these kinds of materials only, and you have to have these kinds of measurements, so on and so forth, right? But imagine then, so this is like the distillation of objective norms or objective values that comes with them into social values and social conventions. In the second case, with regard to this organization of masons, you can see that these kinds of norms that they are dealing with can always be understood as corruptible, because they are not objective, they are codified. Think about this, that organization of masons, because of certain kinds of, I don't know, their vicinity or their monopoly over certain kinds of materials, put this inside their code of laws of how to build a house, that if you do not use, for example, this kind of wood or this kind of metal to make houses because of, you know, the monopoly of that kind of material, you will be punished. So you see that this is no longer objective norms. The values that come with it are no longer objective. What we are talking about, where the objectivity of norms of physis and the value ascriptions that comes with them, not the social ones in the sense of codification of norms, objective norms. So there is a difference between norms as objective and codified norms, socially codified norms. Socially codified norms are always corruptible. And they have nothing to do with sense of knowing. Whereas the first one is all about knowing. So a carpenter who have noticed that certain kind of, basically using certain kind of a different kind of method or using a different kind of material can actually make a better house, right?
Right, so you're like talking about conditions that are also verifiable.
Yes, verifiable.
And like, and if I, because I guess I'm confused about that picture of norms. I mean, I don't want to like go too far down a rabbit hole because I don't want to divert the discussion, but.
Yeah, and also I want Reza to ask you a question, but yeah, let's just like.
Yeah, no, I mean, verifiability is a very good thing. You see, verifiability, yes. I think that if you don't have a semblance of theoretical or practical verifiability, then it's not objective.
No, but the thing is, think about this scenario, which I agree is not, it's much more, okay, you give the example of the mason who can like use shit wood and the house will crash in a year. And then over time we get to know, oh, these materials and these are objective norms. Okay.
Yes, and that's why it makes basically roots these norms in a certain modes of knowing.
Sure.
Revision of knowing of our knowledge base, so on and so forth.
But when you talk about like all of our educations occur in a naturalized space, both.
No, not naturalized space. Naturalized space plus the social one, plus the recognitive one.
Yeah, but this is what I'm trying to say is like, if let's say, I mean, how would you verify? Let's say I decide from this point on never to do wage labor again, then I will be like, I'm trying to phrase this in a way that like isn't so simplified or isn't like the condition, the social, technical, economic conditions that we're in will provide certain conditions of verification
yes.
that are not objective. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I could say,
yes,
well, that's I'm not going to pay my rent because it's like
right. So
thing,
essentially,
but,
yes, absolutely. This is why, as I mentioned, it's the example I meant was narrow to begin with. Like, look, isn't it the Marxian critique that how about this funny fact that, for example, the way that, think about this, this is why I mentioned, like, think about this board of masonry that only allow you to use certain kinds of materials, right? And it becomes even more widespread, such that the capitalist system, the state regime, will only allow you to basically have interaction with certain kinds of materials to experience it. Like, you know, the conditions of the possibility of making a building will be compromised, right? Because these are based on the kind of values that are being entrenched, which are not objective, but they are socially constituted by way of this system of codification. Yes, and that's why that education should be a double-edged sword. Essentially, understand that the mode of knowing should not be subjected by any means possible to what you might call to be values and disvalues given to you by the kind of society in which you live. But that does not mean that you should be oblivious to the fact that even then you might be hijacked by these kinds of values. That makes the idea of education precisely even more difficult, because it's the idea of self-consciousness, historically and individually and socially. Otherwise, I think that this is why I think that if education is not being taken seriously in terms of this whole gradient of knowing and production of values, so on and so forth, it will either turn into some sort of cynicism that we have seen in Marxist communization theory with Jacques Cavalot's real subsumption thesis, that everything that we ever do is actually a symptom of capitalist subsumption, or this idea of a kind of super liberal idea that knowledge simply can bring down these kinds of regimes of suppression and so on and so forth.
But this is maybe a good point to reattach it to something that was said at the beginning. You said it, and also this kind of basically like ways of escaping or exiting the semblance of totalization, right? Or completeness, right?
Yes.
Which feeds into as well the whole kind of
yes, absolutely. The incompletion thesis,
sure.
Not only in terms of knowing, but also in terms of historic self-consciousness.
Absolutely,
yes.
yeah. Yes. No, but that sort of ethos in general, I think, can be mapped into the like computational realm, because that's one of the
definitely. And of course, the whole point of education for now is simply that we need to execute and launch and institute organizations that don't become bipolar with regard to this, and maintain always that kind of necessary, basically what you might call to be commitment to the incompletion thesis. That doesn't mean, of course, to be a Switzerland of education.
Reza, do you have any questions for Patricia and what Patricia presented?
No, I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, everything Patricia says, I always say that, they're great. I mean, it's just like, that's why maybe you shouldn't put us together anymore, because we are allies, right? I have actually a question for Patricia with regard to this. Did you read, Patricia, or maybe other participants? There was this line in Lucy Suchman's, Valentin shared it with us. My apologies, 1 second. This paragraph this paragraph, it's on page 260. It says that, second paragraph, it says that Latour usefully demarcates a middle kingdom with respect to human non-human relations, within which he locates the space between simple translations from human to non-human, on the one hand, and a commitment to maintaining the distinction and purity of those categories on the other. Translation in the case of humans and machines involves practices through which capacities taken to be inherent in one are shifted to or realized through the other. In resisting the particular translation of intelligence and interactivity recommended by AI in the 1970s and 1980s, I turned to a kind of exercise of purification, attempting to maintain those qualities as exclusively human. I now believe that what we need to is, in Latour words, direct our attention simultaneously to the work of purification and the work of hybridization. What do you think about this? I mean, look, it sounds great on the paper, right? But anything that comes out of Latour's mouth, you have to take it with a grain of salt, right? I mean, first of all, middle ground, like it's just like it's a part of the clique culture, right? You know, saying that if people might actually think that I'm an extremist if I say that I want only go non-human or go non-human. So Latour, you know, being this kind of liberal Roman Catholic, right? Yeah, moderate, says that middle kingdom because it sounds cool, right? But it's just clique culture, right? What is really this middle ground, middle kingdom?
I mean, I completely object to the term. I don't find the term sexy at all. The last thing I
no, I mean for people, for some people, you know, for some people, yeah. No, I mean not kingdom, but I mean you know that the whole idea of the middle, the in between. Oh, it's so in between.
Well, listen, like on one, I guess the image. I did read about half of the article, but not with the attention that I probably should have. So I'll admit that now. You know, but the one image that I think about, like this was happening maybe a few years ago. I mean, because I haven't been doing so much work on it, to be honest, but let's say like in the moment of the AlphaGo, you know, achievement, right? Of like, let's say a demonstration of what humans would evaluate as intuitive reason, rather than like calculative reason or something. In a much more high dimensional game space than chess, for instance. Like I was intrigued, the social ramifications afterward, because the whole, of course, the normal narrative was like, oh, you know, the Turing narrative, blah, 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 right? The whole, you know, now we've got an example of machinic intelligence, blah, blah. This kind of really very horrible primary, you know, adjudication setup. And but what was happening afterwards on a social level was that you had the proliferation of these like centaurs. Like, did you ever hear about these? These were like basically this was literally the machine and the human hybrid, like combining of intelligences, and those ended up being like the most successful Go players.
Hence the centaurs, yes.
Yeah, whereas a team, okay. So, but what was maybe it's a silly example, and for sure it's a little bit nerdy, but what it also helpfully does away with is that like pitting of one against the other. These like are perhaps complementary, right? Complementary types of intelligences. And
we talked about that in the first session a little bit, but
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I don't really have much more to say about that.
Yes, no, I think that's a really good idea. But then, but then you see, this is I think Eric Meyer said something really interesting. He said that moderate centrism. I think that you see when we are reading this paragraph in the way that you explained it, yes, it's all good, great. And I would say that why is it great, and it has nothing to do with what Latour trying to say, because what Latour trying to turn this into is a discussion that comes off as moderate centrism. Look, if you see this whole idea of the middle ground between this and that, if it was always the third better in a Peircean sense, then centrism would have more clout than both left and the right. The fact that it doesn't means that it's even worse. So the whole point with this is as simple as that this idea of the central production, right, that you are talking about, is already, we can talk about it about ourselves, that the human is neither an animal nor a purely rational agent. And hence the two vectors that we should always keep in mind when we are defining the human: naturalization in progress and rationalization in progress.
Okay, so because we would like to have some time for maybe people also to engage, let's ask Brunella and Valentin. I'm not sure Valentin is here. He was earlier. Brunella, would you like to join the conversation? Do you have anything to ask or add to what Reza and Patricia were putting on the table?
Yes,
5
thanks so
minutes.
much. I hope well, I'll be quick. Some suggestions. Actually, I don't have anything against Latour. I don't think that the idea of hybrid or cyborg has anything to do with moderation. It's nothing to do, rather the opposite, has much to do with binary logic, either one, either artificial or natural. But what is nature? Nature is anything that humans naturalize. So nature is a naturalization, including the artificial. Another suggestion, autonomy. I agree with you, Reza. What is autonomy? It's a kind of I don't know, banalization of education. So when we teach, when we prime a child to walk, actually when they learn walking, they are autonomous, but autonomous means also primed or introduced into the world of limitations. So what you suggest is makes me think of this. When you rear your children, mine are all children, when you rear your children who are natives of the AI, would you teach them to, teach is not the right word, would you prime them to reinforce their swarm intelligence rather than their autonomy? This is one question. Yeah, okay.
Can you repeat the last point? The last point, like autonomy. So that's why I was trying to say that autonomy has different levels. You know, when we are talking, are we talking about a child versus a swarm of bees?
Yes, autonomy makes me think of individualism. That is, the individual being autonomous from some kind of
But it is not really so, because even the most, for example, when we are reading like early works of Kant before even the Critique of Pure Reason, autonomy is already recognitive, and Sebastian Roll, I think, has been talked about it in his book Self-Consciousness, that even for a child, the autonomy requires a certain kind of recognition of the parents. So, so even when we are saying that I am going to claim my independence as an individual, that is not individualism par excellence in a fundamentalist sense of individualism. It's individualism by individuation, by virtue of recognition of that which is other than me.
This is exactly what I meant. So I agree with you. This is autonomy is a kind of a limit word, a limit concept.
Yes.
Therefore, if autonomy has to be out of question in education, education remains an interesting word because it means guiding outside, ex duco, I guide someone outside.
Yes, outside, to the great outdoors, to the great outdoors, yes.
Is an indeterminacy. So is it not the case that within this indeterminacy, a swarm intelligence should be reinforced from now on after so much ideological individualism or ideal of freedom, liberation, all of these, I would place them into the 20th century. What do you think? And what does Patricia?
Well, I would say that, well, I think that even, look, this is one of the most important.
We talked about swarm intelligence in the first session. Just
Sure. I would say that swarm intelligence, ironically, is actually one of those topics upon which the most libertarian, liberal forms of identification of pronouns, individuation and individuality are being projected to. So swarm intelligence, when we are looking at, for example, even Manuel de Landa, right? Ideas about swarm intelligence are extremely like this kind of liberal mindset projected to them. But yes, I would say that we can have a different scenario. And this is something that Ray Berzier has already been talking about, the view from nowhere. I remember he once jokingly told me, that think about this, that the future of rationality or rational enlightenment should be a mixture of Kant and Mao.
And Mao.
And Mao. You know, and you can say the same thing. The future of education should be basically the integration of this Hegelian incompleteness of autonomy, the progression toward concrete self-consciousness, plus swarm intelligence. You know, the view from nowhere. You know, that the idea that precisely because this is already, I would say, this is already within the idea of education. Even in the Stoics, there is this kinds of idea that, like Epictetus, there is this kinds of idea that to be a rational self is very different from being an individualized self, right? Or a phenomenal self. You can always get rid of the phenomenal self. What you cannot get rid of is the rational self. A rational self is not really a phenomenal self. It is not, it can be basically a collection of swarm agents. It can be basically a mass of red guards in a joking manner that Ray talked about, of Mao, you know, descending from the mountain, so on and so forth.
So reason is the intelligence of the swarm versus individual intelligence.
Yes, reason in a very not in a bloated sense. Reason not in a kind of you know, Habermasian stuff. Reason in the sense of basically certain basically the capacity to conceptualize, and but more importantly, that concepts, the realm of reason, is a realm upon which no human has the ultimate control over, which basically you don't have a hold of it.
Well, going back to Kant, it's the ability to question. It's the necessity to question.
The necessity to question, but the means of questioning we can never master.
Of course, if you find it in the swarm, no individual can ever master it. We need to move together. You know, the swarm is intelligent. The individual nodes or birds just provide for the links for the general intelligence. So no individual is rational. Now the conclusion is almost obvious.
No, absolutely, yes. And that by the same token, the same thing that, you know, we can basically take out phenomenal self models, which usually the cornerstone of how we identify ourselves as individual selves, and still you have the rational component of being intersubjective, so on and so forth. So, and by the way, I made a mistake. Ray was saying that integrating Mao with Metzinger, if you know Metzinger, Being No One, you know, the philosopher of neuroscience, who wrote a book called Being No One, that there is no such a thing as a phenomenal self.
Mm-hmm.
We're at the half an hour mark. I don't see Valentin, but he was not obliged to stay. So let's open up the question, but to encourage you to ask and hopefully add more terminology to the sidebar, I want to ask Reza, this problem that you mentioned in the beginning, right? You know, like this about like the virtual versus real education, right? How much of it has to do with like this centrality of human body that comes from Foucault and biopolitics that is picked up later by so many people, including like Agamben student Membe, whose name was mentioned. So like body becomes central right when, you know what I mean? Like Foucault's writing as the California sort of like ideology and cybernetic and all of that is happening, right? Like, so as cybernetic kind of like applications started to take root in California, we have this idea of like the body being center. How much of it do you think has to do with like this question of the body and embodiment? Particularly,
yes.
like people who diss education online, they say it's not embodied. your bodies are not. It's all about the body in a way, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is that the whole thing is that I would say that actually trivializes the idea of embodiment, right? Precisely because the idea of embodiment has something to do with lived experience. And I'm actually taking side here with Noam Chomsky, who says that the idea of body is even more confused than the idea of the mind. You know, that here I think that this idea that what is really, like, what do you mean by embodied? Like, really, like, I have limbs, I put my limbs into the virtual, I can't put my limbs into a virtual space, and that's not embodied. But that's just like, it's really trivial. I mean, I don't think that we need to basically even go to that route.
Yeah, but I think you're conflating, I mean, obviously embodiment in terms of cognition is like
it's a lived experience.
Yeah,
but lived experience, you can get it in virtual space as well.
Yes, but you're equating what is being sort of it's the wrong word, actually. Like what needs to be critiqued is this kind of like presentism, immediacy as kind of,
well, that's what I'm
not
saying.
The body. The body's not the problem. It's the
the body is also a confused thing. What is body? What is the body?
Maybe the body is confused, for sure, but like at the same time, like your body is part of cognition. It's part of your exploratory apparatus,
yes, of course,
to navigate an environment.
Yes, and
so,
of course, by extension, the body will come to any sort of cognition that I even put into virtual space.
Sure.
Right?
So I'm just saying that, like, the critique that Mo was raising, I think, yes, they often use.
No, I think he was talking about presentism.
But it's presentism, immediacy is like the thing that is the actual object of the fetish.
I brought that up because today, I don't know, this is kind of new. I'm not sure it's new because Art Forum doesn't, no, it's from June. You know that piece that Paul Presidio wrote on pandemic in Art Forum, right? Sort of like talks about the pandemic, but like it kind of begins with this idea of Foucault, that like the most important thing we learn from Foucault is that the living, therefore the mortal body, is a central object of all politics. I take issues with this, and I think we've moved away from that. Maybe it was at some point the central question was the body, right? And I think body cannot be fully subtracted from the discussion, but I think the centrality of body is what I want to like question and problematize. Not that you can just like do away without the body, because I don't want to talk about myself, but like I argued this in a text I wrote for the Robot Love catalog, that like we would not be able to have AI unless you can produce a body for this AGI, right? Like, where is the body? Like, without a full sensing body, you will not be able to have it, because you learn about the world by your body going through the world, right? And your body meaning, like, you know, when the wind comes, when the wind hits you, you feel it with every millimeter of your skin, whereas you don't handle temperature of it. But like a computer can tell the exact temperature of the wind and the speed of it, but the wind reaffirms to you that you exist because you sense it with every inch of your body, right? So that's sort of like, you can't do it without the body. But I think the centrality of the body, the way Foucault, and then in the art
discourse, put the weight on it, yes.
Yeah, the way the art discourse replicate that, because it was,
Mo is totally right here.
Privilege to galleries and museums as like these spaces where you have to go and experience the art, right? I think the centrality is the problem, but I don't want to talk more.
Yeah, and the thing is that, please go on, Patricia.
No, Patricia, please go first. I think the issue is, you know, you always run into trouble when you say the body is the paramount thing. Okay, I think in certain cases it could be still, and for certain populations this could be the case. I mean, you always get into trouble when you make such sweeping things, right? And we all do it, right? Or I mean, I do it too, so there's no diss to Preciado, but the point is like, you're always going to get into trouble when you make those kind of statements, right? Because it's like, there's not like one reigning central political thing, you know. It is a little bit more geographically specific, etc. So I mean, just to say that, like,
to me, Foucault was a perv, and he put body in the middle of everything. I mean,
this is why I think that, look, I think Chomsky is completely right. The idea is that, you see, the way he says that the idea of the body is even more problematic than the idea of the mind. Have we actually got rid of the idea of mind? No, we can't also get rid of the idea of body. But the thing is that there should be a certain kinds of fine graining, conceptual fine graining, as what we mean actually by body. Like literally, like even when we are saying that when an AI needs a body, no, why? I mean, what is this? Like, I mean, are we trying to refute Kant's thesis here? That essentially just because body, if in that case, that that it's just like an apparatus of sensory impressions, it basically is something that is render mind impengible, susceptible to sensory impressions. If that is the case, yes, but do sensory impressions do actually play anything, any fundamental role in basically intelligence or cognitions? No. If we say yes, then you are basically doing the empiricist job here. The sense data, essentially, when you say that body as the organon, as the machination of sensory impression is the most fundamental role, and you can't have cognition without it, you are essentially doing the empiricist job for him. Because what is that? Because it means that already that means that we are attributing a fundamental role to sensory impressions. But sensory impressions by themselves are nothing.
What if we like put it in this framework, right? So, okay, if you put it in the phenomenal self, if you want to critique that, but isn't it through through cognitive deliberations, you can at least, like, isn't the self-consciousness that
that's a different thing. Yes, that's a different thing.
Isn't it about also the recognition of like the epiphenomenal self?
Yes, but
you know what
again,
I mean? Like,
yes, of course. Then this becomes a more nuanced thing. It becomes more like the embodied inactivist paradigms and stuff. But even within the inactivist paradigm, there's a difference between how, for example, our bodily navigation in the world enables us to basically come with new discoveries or manipulate cognitions in a different way, enrich them in a better way, like gestures, all sorts of these kinds of stuff. But even then, it's not a central role. It's not a central role. It is a supplementary role. It is something that is that enriches cognitions rather than being the cognition itself. Because that would be again what Ray talks about the inactivist paradigms. People who thinks that we can simply reduce perceptual judgments to perceiving acts, which are always bodily oriented. Like, for example, like me, like a predator putting itself in a primed running position, takes an orientation and runs toward the prey. Basically, all change of locomotory motions, the coordination of the position of the prey is not going to be cognitively programmed, but is actually part of the bodily motion within the environment. Yes, these are all completely good, great, but these are perceiving acts. They are not perceptual judgments. And what we are talking about are perceptual judgments. Perceptual judgments require sensation as conditions of possibility, but that doesn't make sensations or body or sensory information processing system or perceiving acts central to the problem of cognition.
Okay, so let's just open up for some questions. In the last session, I nominated people to ask questions because I thought they were like a little bit more closer to the topic. But I think maybe we should just go for who has a question before I nominate someone, because there's been a lot of content produced here. Go ahead, Eric. Why am I surprised? Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if you already read the question. Hello, everyone, first of all. And this isn't like a perfectly formulated question, but I just kind of ran with it. It's in the chat box for everyone. Reza, this is for you. That I think I kind of remember you saying somewhere that basically communism equals AI. I don't know if this is my...
No, I didn't say that. Yes, but yeah, something like that.
Yeah, but maybe
no.
Say it's like, it's still helpful or still makes some sense. And so I kind of like the idea that there is this structural parallel between, okay, this building a new social order and basically building AGI, which don't seem to have anything in common at first sight. And I was thinking, okay, does this abstract map of how to build or what AGI actually is, can this actually help in practical political orientations, like not as sufficient, but as at least strategic orientation and as helpful and as giving us some kind of framework? And if this can be of any kind of help, and can there be such a connection, or is this just, okay, one is technical, one is the social political, and yeah, what do you think about that?
Number one, if I have never said something like that, but yeah, I can understand how a semblance of this formula can be made sense of. To the extent that AGI, if taken seriously as a philosophical idea, not merely technical idea, you would say that AGI is simply sublimates the idea of the human whose history, whose definition is not yet complete. So AGI is the exploration of the concept of human in terms of this incompleteness that we were talking about earlier. And communism is also this incompleteness of history, of the idea of the human as its core principle, like Marx and Engels in German ideology, that communism, basically they suggest that communism basically is the idea that it tries to show in theory and practice that the totalization of history is in progress. To show that any sort of state of affairs that tries to call itself an achieved totality of the history of the idea is an illusion. Is an illusion. And hence communism here is like this vector of incompleteness plugged into the idea of self-consciousness. The same thing if you think about it with regard to AGI and the idea of the human. That the idea of the human is incomplete. The more you think about it, the further you construct it. The further you construct it, the further you redefine what to be human entails, right? So that's one. Second, yes, precisely because in the sense that when we are talking about AGI, if we are talking about again, this kind of philosophical idea, we are also thinking about essentially the mind as an artifact. So when we are talking about these kinds of topics, mind as an artifact, then we are already talking about socio-historical fabric, because what is mind? I mean, mind is not differently brain, right? It's social through and through, right? And to be in the realm of the social means that it is entangled with technical problems, a la Simondon, so on and so forth, right? So yes, there is anything that goes into AGI as a philosophical technical project should be rethought also in terms of socio-political and technical, because they are essentially dealing with the same set of problems: sociality of mind, sociality of theoretical and practical cognitions, right? But of course, this all depends on how broad and how robust and how non-parochial our idea of AGI is. on the one hand, and how robust, how non-parochial and broad our idea of sociopolitics is, on the other hand.
Thank you, Reza. Other questions? Heba, would you like to engage our speakers?
I think Maria had a question.
Okay, Maria, go ahead.
In fact, I had two questions, both for Reza and Patricia, but since Patricia asks, I wanted to ask Patricia whether Laboratory Cubonics has own educational platform, and what do you teach, since you were talking about pedagogical efforts. I have seen many such platforms in Russia, and I have mixed feelings for them. Positive because they spread the knowledge and I also participate, but there are some contrasts that they teach metamodernism, such concept that I disagree with. I don't know how to argue because we are not in the academia and these processes are really broken. How do you deal with that sort of things?
We don't have, I mean, I think that was, that was like a major point of, it was like one significant point of criticism that I know I really took on board, amongst many others, of course, after the manifesto, was the lack of any sort of pedagogical mention whatsoever in the manifesto. In terms of what Laboria Cubonics is doing with it, like there will be nothing from it. We wrote one thing and that's kind of it. It's done, So it's not a collective in that sense of like an ongoing durational thing. And as I said, like I have kept this critique has been haunting me like a ghost for these years. And, since now moving more into teaching, want to kind of take it up more explicitly, let's say, to kind of think about ways that we could address, certain problems, certain general problems that are facing us, but then also through whatever vehicles that I have, or that we have at our disposal to access them, either, through these kind of online, say, self-initiated para-academic milieus, or whether that is I have the fortune that my only official teaching position is one-on-one, precisely nurturing students to do their own projects. I have no say in the content whatsoever. They determine everything. And so you really get into that, enabling mode, but precisely they're the ones directing it. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have a better answer for that. And there's no platform. That's for sure. And there won't be one from that collective, from that group. Mm-hmm.
And I also, sorry for taking much time. I had a question for Reza. We read the review on Shoshana Zuboff's book, and Rob Lucas said that it was, rather than capitalism, it was the government and the military complex behind the unhuman robotic machine and that data collection. Could it be that the inhuman knowledge is some kind of embodiment of the army? This is what I thought. And I didn't make any conclusions because I was puzzled by this outcome.
I'm glad you didn't. I'm kidding.
Inhuman, in the sense that I define inhuman like as exploration of the human, or inhuman as what we call, for example, like, any sort of what you might call to be human adjacent AI, right? If in the first sense, no. I mean, obviously that's just like, the idea of the exploration of the human is a very form of self-consciousness of being human, through which we say that human has always been the inhuman, because it is revisable. Its definition is revisable, right? It is already born with the incompleteness of its history as the engine of its own revolutions in theory. And
yeah, I thought the first definition, yes.
Yes. Whereas in this second sense, yes, of course. When I think I suggested this last time that I talked to Mo, Patricia, Brunella. There is this. I highly suggest this as an addendum to Zuboff's Surveillance Capitalism book. Rob Lucas' critique of it in New Left Review. It's called the Surveillance Business by Rob Lucas.
Yes, we shared it with everyone to read.
Yes. So yes. So essentially, he also had the same thing that for example, when we are talking about this stuff, Facebook doing this, Facebook doing that, our data are being stolen. This has nothing to do with capitalism, really. It's just that it's a kind of a hybrid of a state mutating with regard to technology, and we shouldn't really say that, well, these are just like basically capitalist modes of surveillance or capitalist modes of interference, so on and so forth. It's just they have something to do with the hybridization or basically the fusion of a state and technology at a very deeper level than what we have witnessed. And to that extent, yes, we can see that, it's no longer secret. It's actually quite trivial at this point to see that these kinds of views of the human adjustment that we have in many of these AI circles and stuff are fundamentally rooted in basically what you might call to be certain kind of shady complexes, technological complexes, military, information gathering, so on and so forth. And I don't think that we should, as I definitely agree with Rob Lucas, that I don't think that we should jump the gun and say that, well, these are just capitalists by nature, right? No, I don't think so.
This is like maybe helpful to think about it in terms of the way that, if you want to talk about the kind of creation of the milieux, it's like I have the book beside me because I kept thinking like, Yuk should be here talking about his whole sort of critique, but not dismissal of cybernetics, let's say. But also just because I mentioned him just because of his connection with Simondon and the way that these technical, individuals compose technical ensembles, which is like these kind of bigger pictures and these kind of information transits going on that possibly lead to the transformation of that very ensemble. It's hard to imagine, but that's like, it's just to say that I agree. I don't think it's de facto. I don't think like a particular technology is only, it can only be seen within a capitalist framework. I think that there's other possible contexts in which it can exist. But of course, the point is like, how do you create those different contexts? And I think, but in somebody like, say like Alberto Toscano years ago was writing quite well about this, about, that it's not even about making a blanket statement that everything is reappropriable for a different end. He's like, no, I think, certain technologies, certain infrastructures lend themselves to certain functions, and those need to be adjudicated on a case-by-case basis, in a sense.
Thanks. Heba, I didn't want to take you by surprise, but I saw you turning your microphone on and off. But if you want to interject or say something or ask a question, feel free.
I'd actually, Enda keeps raising his hand. I'd like to give him an opportunity first.
Okay, no problem. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry, this question is like going to be a bit mixed up, but hopefully it'll make sense. So I'm thinking about the demands of the planetary as being something that, in a sense, the rationality that inheres within this is somehow beyond the scope of the kind of subjective rationality that we currently have, like as a kind of resource. And it's not just a matter of that being like that it's too vast to comprehend, but rather that the kind of rationality that we're talking about when we think about kind of temporally distributed things like logistical networks, political problems that would happen on a planetary scale, or like global finance, those are in a sense, not tractable to the subject. They need a kind of like secondary kind of rational, sort of rational instrument to be able to kind of digest and parse the information that's going on. So this kind of relates to the point we were just talking about with Simondon. So my question about this is kind of like, when you bring that back to the pedagogical problem, or the question of like how to kind of educate kind of subjects in relation to these kind of systems that it seems will become more and more necessary in any kind of like planetary oriented kind of project, isn't it in a sense only possible for the mechanism through which this information is parsed to be tractable to the individual person, but not the information itself, which this kind of mechanism is parsing in order to kind of comprehend? And in this sense, does this kind of put in jeopardy the recognitive aspect of the education, or the kind of the subject education in a sense, because the subject does not like recognize the data set, and it's kind of more or less heuristic, right? It's a heuristic process. And so in that sense, does it kind of produce a limitation, or like a kind of a stopping point of like our ability to critique those kind of systems through which these kind of like really broad or large scale rational phenomena are intelligible to like individual subjects? And then like further on to that, there's like political ramifications in terms of like, how you can have kind of like a critical discourse in democratic systems and so on, to be able to kind of calibrate those systems through which we understand those like large scale and incredibly distributed and complex phenomena. Sorry, that's like, and it's like, that's all really jumbled up, but hopefully it makes a bit of, right? And it's like just a general question, so like has something to say to it.
I can only say something that, yeah, to be honest with you, I am extremely cynical about the perspectives of individual subjects at this point be able to be reconnected back to those kinds of rational, complex systems that you are talking about. And look, both on the side of right and on the side of left, we are seeing a cognitive disconnection here at an extremely alarming rate. And of course, this only lead to political atavism. My answer is simple as that.
A colleague was talking about this in terms of like, the divergence between these two worldviews is creating this like valley, like,
Yes,
left and right live in two completely different worlds now.
It eventually leads to atavistic political forms of engagement, which are quite dangerous on both sides. And I don't see, without a robust, well-funded political understanding of education, which is never going to happen in our lifetime, this can even get any closer. Actually, I would say that it's only going to get worse. So I'm extremely cynical, pessimistic about the consequences of these things. And people think that, oh, well, education is not really important. Well, think again.
Well, I think it's such a good question, and maybe I understood it incorrectly, but you just tell me if I did. But it was like, also, were you also making the inference that like these types of complex structures are actually, it requires an aggregate intelligence essentially, anyways, right? And then because that is also like, although I know how much these theories of recognition are dependent on understanding the mind is always social in the first place, right? So we're not talking about, there's no delusion that in your model, Reza, that I'm some cutoff agent in the world and just thinking things and what have you. No, I'm a social agent. But I am really concerned about that aggregate type of intelligence as well. And when you connect it back to, because like we haven't discussed power in this arrangement, which would lead to another 10 hours. But, I remember Ben Cerveny, a designer, programmer guy, made a comment once in a lecture that I thought was really poignant, and it was just basically like those agencies that hold power these days are the gatekeepers of complexity. And so that is big banks, that is risk management, that is like, you know, search engine monopolies, what have, right? Anyone who has access to this like treasure trove of complex aggregated information is like a gatekeeper to complexity. And that is like one. And so, you know, since I had, you know, since that heard that and had a predilection to interest in complex systems in general, just like, yeah, like how do we start making claims on access to this, which I agree looks dire in our current pedagogical or environment. But nonetheless, I think like, yeah, you still have to keep certain ambitions alive, right? Otherwise you just get into despair. But yeah, in terms of how those aggregate intelligences come together to form some general picture of the operation of things to thereby enable some mode of navigability within it, because that will arguably be required to transform it. This is a major task, absolutely. I mean, I'm not, yeah, I guess I think there's also this disconnect these days too between like this sense of I think there's in some parts there's a sense of a will for a transformation and a deep frustration because we don't necessarily know what activities correspond with the objective fact of impending catastrophe, right? An existing catastrophe in many parts of the world, existing catastrophe for those of us in Europe, impending catastrophe. Does an objective, rational conclusion, and then not necessarily knowing what the appropriate means, gestures, and modes are to combat that. And that's, I mean, that is again, when I was asking Reza earlier too about this connection, I mean, obviously I was talking about norms in a slightly different mode, more on the social normative way, but like how you connect certain things that you know, facts or information about the world into certain practices, you know, and that's where I think like these, you know, this is where you run into big hurdles when a lot of activism is, you know, rightfully focused on raising awareness, right? But then it's also like, what do we do with the awareness? You know, that's the next question. And that's like deeply troubling, or you get these rather vague statements like, and this is not a criticism because I hate the crapping on Greta, she's a teenager, but like Fridays for the Future, for instance, you know, well, whose future? What is the quality of that future? The future will come regardless if it's with humans or not. So what is the qualitative dimension in that demand for futurity, you know, and like, how do we start loading that and then trying to think about the steps that you need to make in the here and now towards that, that ambition. And those are, you know, these are really quite terrifying and daunting tasks, I think, but I see them as like really concrete dilemmas or blockages to getting over that frustration, which I feel it in, you know, I just, yeah, I feel like we're all frustrated. We know things are really not in a good place and don't necessarily know. And I think that's also because we're still caught in a social structure where we, you know, where it's still, you know, individual exceptionalism is kind of the rule. That's the main incentive in our culture. So, or in a Western culture, I can say that I'm also North American, so it's even amplified. And even if we know it's insufficient, like maybe even don't even know what the proper gestures are towards moving into that sort of like aggregate type of intelligence that would be required to start thinking through the gestural like consequences of these ideas.
Mo, I think that we have someone asking question, an anonymous attendee. I can't read it. I mean, I tried.
It jumped away from me. So if you can read it, please, let's save the time from me finding it, and please read it for us.
Yeah, it's a question and answer button. Then there, I don't know. That's the whole point.
It's in Q&A.
Because of my bad eyesight, I tried to read it. I just couldn't.
I was looking in the chat for it. Okay, a question for Reza specifically, but for everyone for that matter, in regards to the body and bodily cognition, without hopefully being a Foucauldian perv, LOL, I would take that Reza wouldn't say that, let's say, digital cybernetic singularity, sexual interactions are the same as the physical real thing, or Zoom mediated techno parties are the same as in-person raves at Berghain. I mean, I added the at Berghain. I'm just pointing this out because for him to say that bodily cognition is supplementary rather than central possibly can make us ignore particular, albeit let's agree, rare situations in which bodily cognition is central, predation situation, sexual encounters, etc. And also in terms of body language and instinctive communications that are non-abstractable, structurable, at least in that specific moment. Also, there's a notion in which Foucault equates the education of the body qua conditions of spirituality as precondition and preparation of knowledge for accessing the abstract of reason itself. So, I mean, it's a
right. I mean, there are good points. Like
I can't copy paste it. I'm going to screen share it because I think it's good to save this for later. But go ahead, Reza. You can begin answering if you want.
Sure. Yes, of course, a Zoom party is not the actual party. But what does that even mean, right? You know. Obviously, what we were talking about was the role of body with regard to the idea of education, namely what you might call to be the cultivation of objective cognitions in their objective range and objective capabilities, theoretical and practical. So in that sense, yeah, of course, you know, in so many human activities, body plays a central theme, right? But what we are talking about, like for example, sexual interaction. So we have one sexual interaction at sexual interaction 1, right? It would be just like basically intercourse, right? And courting, of which happens among the animals as well. And the other one, sexual interaction in the ones that Foucault talks about, sexual interaction in a societal context, right? Socio-political context. So the first one, the body is playing a central role, right? And you can see it among the animal kingdom. And we are also animals, right? We are also sentients, but we are also sapiens, you know? With regard to the second role, I don't think that even Foucault would have said it, that role of body is central to sexual interaction. In fact, the whole idea of the, you know, the basically his critique of sexuality is precisely because the central role of certain kinds of societal norms, cognition, judgments, adjudications, arbitrary or otherwise, allegedly or not, that are applied to the centrality of the centrality of the so-called centrality of the body in sexual interaction. So it's not as if that Foucault would say that Foucault is a socialist rationalist. In fact, he's not going to ever say that role of the body is central in sexual interaction, because then it would render the idea of social sexual interaction something quite ordinary and prevalent that happens, which then makes his basically socio-political critique of modern basically dogmas of sexuality completely irrelevant, because these dogmas are coming not because of the centrality of the body, but because of the centrality of other kinds of factors which are not actually have anything to do with that sense of body that we usually understand in philosophy, or in, for example, in embodied cognitive action. But yes, of course, this is, maybe I went too far by saying it's supplementary. I didn't mean it in that way, but I meant it that simple as that centrality of the body, even within Foucault, is not this kind of centrality of the body that we are talking with regard to centrality of body in animal kingdom or embodied cognitive action. When he talks about centrality of the body, if he ever does, he is talking about it as being morphed fundamentally by other kinds of social cognitive factors. That's the whole point of it.
Thank you, Reza.
My pleasure.
So we're
sorry, we have some sort of cat fight.
Oh, really?
Yes. Outside, no, in the house.
Oh, it's yours. Okay, I was like, what is that noise?
Yes. We have 3 cats. They were just like beating each other up.
Are there any questions? Now, if there's any time left, I would like to return to that text that the machine produced from the first session, right? Mm-hmm. And if you scroll up, we can also supplement it again, just to take a look at it. And the idea was like our experts would have something to say about that production, because we would really like to continue on. There's a lot of extra terms that were added in the second session, which we would like to add it after we finish the second part of the workshop and work on it. But it would be great if Reza and Patricia can speak like a few words to that text, so we get some direction as to where to go with it, especially if we're gonna like submit it to the newest text generation AI via our colleague that has access to it, which is something I really am curious about doing. So Castra, do you mind pasting the 5 different versions again? There it is. I see them. It just let me just maybe do it myself because I ran into it. So that's one of them. He's sharing them now. Here we go. They're here.
Which one is it?
It's if you scroll to the text down. Hypercritical modernity could determine uncertainty far away from keyboard. Things like that.
Oh, okay. I mean, my apologies. I have this really bad astigmatism. It's really hard to, let me just actually, okay, let me copy paste this.
That's what I'm doing
too. Increase the size.
My monitors are, the camera's here and my working is here. So.
Right.
My way of dealing with it is I change reading glasses from monitor to like shorter, smaller text.
Oh,
well, no. I can't, unfortunately, because I have both extreme short-sightedness and extreme astigmatism.
This text was minimally copy edited, very minimally though, okay, by me and Martina.
Is the, okay, and then chaotic elements, okay, yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Is it Machines of Loving Grace? Is it from the famous poem?
Yes, these words were supplied by the participant throughout the first session, right?
Yeah,
like
that's I know that. I know. It's what's that? Basically fishing trout in America. It's yeah, I think that's his poem. Richard Brodigan, yes. Okay.
So basically what we're reading is a text without intentionality, is that right? In the sense, okay.
Why don't you submit this as an abstract to one of these Deleuzian journals?
Reza, behave yourself.
I'm afraid I'm afraid. I'm curious to know what would GP3 make up of these 5 different paragraphs if you feed it separate, which this is something I'm proposing to do, is to feed them separately to GP3 now, each one, and see what would GP3 produce in terms of the result. So that's what, and but I think before that, we would also incorporate in the same method terminology from the second session to be able to sort of like include Reza and Patricia and those who ask question into this, and then see what kind of like Butlerian text do we get? You know what I mean? Like,
no, Butler, no, please, no, let's not ask. Butler is a very actually fantastic thinker. She needs a good editor, but we are not supposed. We are not going to make fun.
But who are you
Absolutely
talking about?
not on my
Judith
watch.
Butler.
Octavia or Judith?
No, Judith.
Judith Butler.
Oh.
We can make fun of Agamben, maybe a little bit of CCRU poetry and the Louisiana here, but not Judith Butler.
Okay, so if no one has any other suggestion as to how to process this, we've already saved this.
Well, I think that this isn't it the whole idea that you have to do a little bit of human edits?
Yeah.
Then give it, and then kind of like a streamlining. It's just like the Centaur production that Patricia was talking about.
I mean, from the beginning, the combination of human intelligence and artificial intelligence was part of what we began as the idea for this workshop, right? So in that spirit, we did minimal editing, but really very minimal, right? Martina, do you want to say a few words, because I feel it needs you to supplement like what we did and how we did it.
Yeah, I think in regards to this, it kind of brings me back to a question that I had before. I think it kind of got lost in the chat, but it kind of makes me think of the principle of non-equivalence. And it's something that I was returning back since I've read Anil's text in the last few days. And it's maybe like a better way to pose it than what Latour was saying, in my opinion. And so I think the problem with that is that it brings on this continuous like translative effort on our part. And my own difficulty with it, and what I think it's kind of interesting to question and to prod, is in trying to automate, are we actually doing more work? What is this? Because if we are saying that, you know, we concede that the human and the AI are kind of the same thing, and there is this horizontal distribution of reason and intelligence, but then these different languages that we're speaking, how are we making them communicate? And are we actually producing an excess by trying to translate one into the other and back and forth and back and forth? So where is the economy, and where is actually the excess? Where is the residue that we're producing? What is this dust that is kind of left behind? Do we need it? Can we avoid it? Yeah, I don't know. It's a very broad question that I have for myself, and I'd be interested to know what Patricia and Reza think of this.
Maybe, do you want to, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot. So if you're tired or you don't feel like you want to say anything, just say so. But this kind of, instead of the what is it, the middle kingdom or whatever, this principle of non-equivalence, would you mind to say a little bit more about that?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, sure. I have a very rudimentary understanding of it, and it's mainly like through Anil's text. So Anil makes a reference again throughout the text, and he references and he uses a humanist point of view. And he says that in understanding these different ways of cognition, it's okay to distribute them equally across different agents. And the only thing that we can concede is that they are non-equivalent. And so, and this is like a concept that he takes from Laruelle, if I remember the text correctly. And it's just, I'm trying to figure out what is a productive way think about this in a way where the two communicate without kind of circling back to a kind of very reductive humanism, which saying, no, it's all, you know, it's all the same and it's made by us and it's intelligible because it's made by us. No, there is an extent to which it's other. But then how does that relationship become productive? Yeah, and yeah.
Right. So, but it's also like, well, maybe you have to ask yourself, this is maybe the, yeah, like you have to ask yourself, like did you even consider for whom this text is destined as a possible option? Just in the sense of like, I mean, isn't it in a way, are you not falling back into the humanist default setting by assuming that this, whatever gets produced out of the workshop is supposed to be intelligible for a human audience? Like, wouldn't it be funny maybe to work on the opposite way, in the sense of like, hang on, I'm losing my train of thought. It's like dinner time. But do you know what I mean? Like working rather than the machine doing all this kind of labor to make it intelligible for you, you're doing all the labor to make it intelligible for the machine somehow, just as a funny like swapping of roles, so to speak.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm allowed to say something while Martina gather her thoughts, but the Aphex Twin album Cyro, which came out in 2014, I wrote a short review of it, and for me, what was interesting about it was like this was like the first impression that came to me when I listened to the whole album, was that it seemed like he was like, the music sounded like humans are gone or are not significant anymore, and the AI was we're using elements from jazz, hip hop, and all sorts of human remain influence of music to make music for itself rather than make it for humans. And it wasn't even caring for whether this gonna like make sense to humans, they're gonna like it or not. But it was sort of like as if humanity has gone, and we're like a museum of ideas, and they kind of like revisited some sounds and some influences and made something for themselves, you know. And so in that sense, I think what Patricia said makes sense to me, because yeah, like why a lot of times, like, I mean, you look at emojis, look at a lot of things we do online, we do it makes sense to humans, but actually it makes more sense to AI, especially the way they're able to like put it all together and synthesize it, right? So also another thing I was going to add, this is like a saying, you probably have heard it, right? Like E equals MC2. Like there's this like funny riddle, maybe Reza remember from Iran. It's like this guy bought oranges for like $100 a crate and sold it for $10 a crate, but he became a millionaire. How could that be possible? And the answer is, well, he was a billionaire and then he became millionaire, right? So there was no economy there, but E equal MC2. But those people who bought those cards actually took that value back home. So nothing was lost. It was just distributed, right? So the wealth of oranges were distributed among those who were lucky enough to buy an orange crate that was $100 worth for $10, right? So you know what I mean? Like, it's like, I don't think anything gets lost here, or like any extra labor is meaningless or something. I don't know if I made any sense.
You're muted, Mo.
Reza, would you like to say something to Martina's question, or should we wrap
No,
up?
I don't have anything. I just was curious. Has anyone actually given this to some sort of AI for analysis and tagging certain repetitions of terms and grammars to actually decompose this, like, you know, like data analysis, data analytics, right? You know, how it basically dealt with our data exhaust, according to Zuboff. You know what data exhaust is, like, you know, the kind of shit data that you generate by doing stuff on internet, not your actual data that is being recorded or your search stuff, like the most auxiliary kind of data that sites like website, Facebook or social media accumulate by way of you doing like the most trivial stuff and selling this data exhaust to some sort of like Peter Thiel, company or data analytics. And then they are actually going to give it to an AI, decompose it, recompose it for a new human analysis. Like, who has written this?
I think that's what open
At
AI.
what age? At what age? I mean, has anyone done that, like with these kinds of stuff?
Open AI, which has produced GP3, is actually partially owned by Peter Thiel. So I think that's kind of like one of their side objectives, Reza. Like it's like that's what the whole thing is about, because it's constantly browsing all Twitter in order to generate. It's constantly reading the web. So it's
I mean, even not. We don't need even like kind of like his like intelligence analysis software. What's that? Is it Gotham? We actually need just like certain kinds of basic software to tag this, analyze the repetition of words, certain kinds of syntaxes, and parse them, categorize them into certain categories of writing. So we can understand that, for example, when even the most kinds of basic things that we do or say, no matter how nonsensical it is, how can they actually be reanalyzed?
Well, Reza, there's like the tool actually does that. If you go to the JSON tab in the tool, that's what this is kind of doing. It kind of like breaks it down, and then you could easily start seeing patterns get repeated.
I will check it. I haven't checked it yet. I haven't checked it.
Very simple tool that Valentin gave us that produces this. In the JSON tab, it kind of like divides it up for you. And actually, there's a colorized version of it. And then with the color, you start seeing what kind of patterns appear in these different versions.
Okay. I will definitely check it.
I encourage everyone to use the tool. So it's 8:28. We actually went over the board a little bit. We will keep in touch with you. Most of you who are here are new center people, and we're already in a community. So this work can continue on. We're going to make a group out of you and share with you what we produce out of the text that was composed in the first session and the second session and the GP3 results, to see what we can do with it, and certainly share it with Heba for their purpose. Because from the beginning, the idea was that this won't be just a passive like Zoom session where people only just listen and nothing comes out of it. So we wanted something concrete, however meaningless and trivial, to come out of it as a sort of like an exercise. So thank you, Heba, for providing the opportunity, and thanks to everyone who participated. If you have any kind of like final remarks, this is the time to say it.
I want to say thank you for this, a lot of food for thought, and for participating with us and collaborating with us, and on behalf of Mosaic Rooms and behalf of my exhibition. I think these are a lot of ideas that we've been thinking through in the last couple of weeks, and hopefully for the next couple of months. So I hope that we stay in touch. I'm not planning on taking this and using it for my purpose. I just want to clarify that. But the idea being is, how can we think through these new methodologies that are constantly creating new content? So I'm happy to kind of come back to the table and see where we end up with this material.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Turn off the recording. I just wanted to like off recording say like